Welcome into the I-80 Club +1. Josh Peterson and Jack Mitchell with you, and we are so happy to welcome onto the podcast from the Shutdown Fullcast, and for the purposes of today's conversation, one of the co-hosts of Who Killed College Football, available wherever you get your podcasts or on Substack. It is Ryan Nanni. Ryan, thank you so much for taking the time. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. Thank you for having me.
We are pumped to have you on. I wanted to start with, I guess, a two-parter for you. One was, why maybe was now the right time to put a project like this into the world? And as you and Godfrey, Steven Godfrey, the co-host on this, as you two talked about in the prologue, like, the sport is not dead. Nobody has killed it. So why decide on that name as well?
You know, it's funny because we're recording this immediately after, the week after, a really good week of college football, like a really entertaining week of college football at multiple levels with multiple teams and conferences and all of that. And at the same time, I don't know if y'all have seen this part. Just today, as we are recording, there are already reports that the SEC and the Big Ten are pushing to change the playoff agreement in the next round of negotiations so that they, I believe, each have 4 guaranteed slots in the playoffs. So I feel a little bit better after seeing that like our theory still works. Anyway.
Something still sucked. Good. Yes. Yeah, fantastic.
I guess the why now. So this is an idea that Steven and I have kicked around for probably 4 or 5 years at this point. And mostly it's just born from a desire to better understand what's happening to the sport sort of in that time span where, you know, I think we all were used to, okay, conference realignment happens and the NCAA falls on its face sometimes and these TV deals get really big. But really in the last few years, things have grown sort of out of control. And I think we also noticed that we were seeing more listeners and readers and just fans of the sport who were kind of feeling bummed out by it all, like kind of feeling like this was becoming more unrecognizable, harder to sort of square, harder to sort of understand because it abandons in a lot of ways the things that we think have made the sport special, the things that we think have made it different from pro football. So the why now is I guess I would flip it into why not now? Like there's never a time I think where we're going to be able to sit and say like, okay, college football settled down. Now let's take a look at what happened. That time is clearly never going to happen in this sport.
Ryan, like when you're hearing from some people that are just like you were alluding to, sort of, it just feels like a lot or it feels gross or something like that. You know, I think I feel that sort of in a vague way, but it also doesn't really take away from my excitement about Saturdays in some ways. Do you think there is kind of a I don't know if it's not a demographic, but the who are the fans, or is it the schools, or who has really been, I don't know, I guess had the most taken away from their own love of what the game is now compared to what it used to be, do you think?
So I think there's 2 answers to that. One is practical and one is hypothetical. The practical answer is if you are a fan of, I would say, like a mid-tier team, whether that's like, you know, a team that never wins its power conference, but like is certainly in the mix sometimes, and a team that if you win 9 games in a season, like, holy hell, that's great. Like that's a high watermark for you. You have sort of watched, like, you know, to pull a recent good example out of a hat, Illinois is having a great year so far. Lost to Penn State, but like played them pretty close, still having a really good year. If they win 9 games, like Illinois doesn't do that often. In past years, you could say, okay, well, Illinois, I mean, we saw this just last year. Here is the path where Illinois can get to the Big Ten championship. Now you've added USC and Oregon and Washington. UCLA probably doesn't matter for purposes of this year. And you sort of like, okay, now my hill is impossible to climb. We didn't lose Ohio State and Michigan and the aforementioned Penn State. Other teams, Rutgers and Indiana, are having good years. Nebraska's having a good year. Like, you now look at it and you're sort of like, well, what am I playing for? Now I am playing to hope that I can finish 8th in the conference? What does that get me? What does that mean? Like, I think there's something about the idea that there was always something to aspire to that now has been like really stripped down and really watered away if you are a fan of like a certain class of teams in the sport.
Sure.
The speculative answer is I think like younger people who are getting into the sport or might get into it now, it's harder to explain like what the appeal is because now it is going to be so playoff focused and so focused on these two conferences. And I think we're all sort of used, I assume that most of us on this podcast are old enough to remember a time when the Big Ten was not a college football dominance conference, like where they often had a lot of bad years, and it was sort of like, why can't they win a bowl game? Why do they keep losing? Why is Ohio State losing to Virginia Tech? Granted, they won the national championship that season, it all worked out. And the Pac-12 was interesting, and the Big 12 was interesting, and the ACC like could at least put out some teams that you were like, man, I don't know about the whole conference, but this team is scary. The Boise State thing when they were knocking off Giants, there are all these little interesting facets of college football that all the edges are getting sanded off. And I think now if you are somebody coming to the sport with fresh eyes and without sort of the knowledge of what it has been, what you are being offered increasingly sounds like, oh, this is really good minor league football. And it is like really good at the top level, but I don't know what it means to you after that. You have to be really into regional rivalries or, the sort of like smaller bits of the sport that increasingly the sport itself is telling you like you don't have to care about those things as much as you used to.
Ryan, along those lines, so Jack and I, both Nebraska guys, he went there for law school. I graduated there undergrad. You're a Florida guy. And so these programs find themselves in very interesting spots, right? Whereas if like, I wonder if we're having the same conversation 30 years ago, are we saying, what do you mean? The sport's great right now. There's nothing to complain about. And so I use that as maybe a backdoor way to asking, given that you hear from fans from all over the country, what do Georgia and Bama and Ohio State and Michigan fans, et cetera, what do they think of this exercise, given that like things are going fairly well for them to outright great for them? Meanwhile, and Nebraska's been in the wilderness for 10 years. It just is like, what's the future of the sport? And so it's like for one part of the fandom, it's like, this is great. For the others, it's like, this isn't the sport that I grew up loving.
Mm-hmm. I think even if you are on the winning side of this equation, and there are winners, to be very clear,
sure,
I think it still feels a little weird because none of those programs were in bad shape 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Like none of them, I don't think this is really like, oh, this is changing our destiny for the better. If you are Bama, Ohio State, Georgia, Oklahoma, Michigan, like you showed that you could do it in the old system and in the old sort of setup. And I think now it's sort of like, okay, well, is it going there becomes more about like, is it going to feel as special if you lose 2 games on the way to a national championship? Like it still counts. And, nobody cares that we haven't seen an undefeated Super Bowl champion in forever. Like it's still awesome. And we still can acknowledge how good some of these, like a Patrick Mahomes team, we can be like, yeah, they're killers. It's amazing. But it will feel a little different in that regard. And it's also just, I think one of the underrated things that we're losing is the real reliable sense of scheduling. Like, as a Florida fan, it's weird that we're not playing South Carolina this year. Is South Carolina like the biggest rival Florida has, or even one of the 3 biggest rivals Florida has? No, but there is something nice to sort of knowing about like, okay, this is who we play all the time. This is who we see all the time. These are the games we go to all the time. These are where like a lot of the on the ground traditions are born of like, oh yeah, every other year me and my friends, we all go to Nashville for the Vanderbilt game or something like that. Or we all go to Oxford because we play Ole Miss every year or something like that. As these conferences get bigger and bigger, the opportunities for those things are going to go away. And it's just going to feel like, okay, I know 4 of the teams are playing this year. And beyond that, I don't know who we're playing or where.
Ryan, we talked a little bit about like how this affects populations. I'm curious, like about your own. So, this sounds so weird to call it your journey. That's a dumbass word. It's the first one that came to my mind. But like, I mean, I presume at some point you had a pretty significant level, and maybe still do, of attraction to the sport, attraction to being a fan of a team, to the point that you've dedicated parts of your career to it. Mm-hmm. And so, did you lose what? And I wonder this too, kind of about the whole sort of extended universe of the Shutdown Fullcast and everything else. Like, probably speak for yourself, but did you lose whatever that attraction was? Does it look different now than it did for you 15 years ago, 10 years ago? Or is this just kind of maybe a normal metaphor? Josh might be able to relate to this. Maybe it's more of a metamorphosis that just kind of happens when you go from being a fan to some form of media. What's that been? And then to tie it all in, the subject of the podcast, how's that impacted that?
So the fan to media thing is very real. And I think how I have felt that most aggressively is that the schools that I hated the most as just a fan, it kind of dissolves. There are still, like, listen, I'm not going to root for Georgia. I'm not going to root for Florida State. Those things they're just not happening. They're not on the table. But, like, I can find teams and fan bases, and I have way more Georgia friends now as a media member than I did as a fan, for sure. I can find teams more interesting, and I can appreciate, I think, more about a wider variety of teams when it's not just like what's happening to Florida. It's also really helpful because if I just had to focus on Florida football in 2024, I can't imagine the misery that I would be stuck in. But I have permission to sort of move around a little bit. I think the interesting thing to me about the pod is that I don't feel like my love of the game and the sport has really gone down that much at all. I think what it is for me is that I am, and maybe this is like formerly being a lawyer or something, I'm really interested to see, like, how did we get to this point? And that's a lot of what litigators do, is they're sort of like, okay, we have arrived at a problem, and now I have to work back and figure out what went wrong here. What were the decisions that happened that led us to this? And I think what's interesting to me about college football, like, you look at another sport, we'll take baseball. The Athletics are moving to Sacramento and then maybe to Las Vegas, and it's a whole mess. It's very clear why that happened. Like, if you want to point a finger, you can say it's the ownership of the Oakland A's and it's the rest of the owners of Major League Baseball. They made these decisions. They made this happen. It's not a mystery. College football exists in this weird ownerless space where, like, there's no one person in charge. There's no one group in charge. And I think what's interesting to me and why we wanted to do the podcast at all and in this format is I find it very, very fascinating to sort of unpack, like, well, why are we here? Like, it's all well and good to sort of talk about, like, the Mountain West is talking to Northern Illinois about becoming a football-only member. But if you just step back from that and you say, like, well, why is that the case? How did we get to that point in time? I think that's where it's really interesting. So in some ways, it has kind of reinforced my interest and fascination with the game. It's just on a big, weird structural level. And I think what I hope, to tie this all up, is that it takes people who are feeling anxious or glum or just bummed out about, like, what's happening to the sport and where it's going, and at least helps walk them through, like, let's understand why this all happened, how we got here, and let's maybe try to understand who the decision makers are and how they're going to impact the sport going forward. Because, again, it's not going to stop.
Ryan, one more from me before we get into episode 1. And it's funny because I was going to ask you, like, are we just getting older? Are we getting more get off my lawn? Like, my grandpa probably 30, 40 years ago was like, this is stupid that every game is on TV now. But then you say what you just did about the latest conference realignment news. And I'm like, maybe maybe this isn't just about being, telling the sport to get off our lawn. And there's something that goes way beyond that.
There is an element of it, to be sure. And I think about that in terms of, like, South Carolina, to go back to them, moving to the SEC. You can find older SEC fans who still think, like, that's weird. South Carolina's not an SEC team. They used to be an ACC team. Like, it just is. Or Arkansas moving from the Southwest. They're like, these aren't real SEC teams. But over time, we just kind of get used to this stuff. The same is true of having a playoff at all. Like, the controversy that resulted from even having the BCS, short of before you got into, like, oh, how does the BCS actually run, was major. But now, I don't think as a group fans are actively like, oh, it's so weird that we have a playoff of some form in college football. We might not like how big it is. We might not like how it operates, how the selection process works, all of that. But the concept is less appalling to us. That said, most of the changes that we are talking about were kind of incremental. Nebraska moving to the Big Ten is a good example. Like, digging back through some of the research for that, when Nebraska left, Tom Osborne made two things very clear. One, he was like, I hope the Big 12 survives. I don't think one team leaving a conference kills it. I don't think two teams leaving a conference kills it. Nebraska left the day after Colorado said they were going to the Pac-12. He also said, I think six teams leaving a conference kills it. And that was very clearly a shot at Texas and A&M, the rumored Pac-16 thing. Like, he read the writing on the wall. But he also said, and it was either him or the school president at the time who said this, that, like, this is a move we have to make for stability. We have to be somewhere, and our athletic department has to be somewhere where we have confidence that everybody's rowing in the same direction, that we're all sort of working together as a business unit. And so I think when you look at the micro changes, everybody can get on board with it. The problem is just sort of like how that has spiraled. And like, now we're in a place where that's sort of the same logic that led to Oregon and Washington joining the Big Ten. They needed to be somewhere more stable. But I think where we get back to this isn't get off my lawn is like, how did the sport get to a point where the Pac-12 couldn't be stable and where Oregon and Washington had to where Washington has to fly across the country on a Friday night to lose to Rutgers? There are... Washington and Oregon can be right in their assessment of what needed to happen, but the sport as a whole has a lot of questions to ask about like how we got to the point where that was a valid concern and a valid answer.
It's interesting to hear you describe this before I get to my next question, because we've taken all these incremental steps that have not been too jarring, right? But then if you go ahead and you look back from all of those years ago and you look at where we are now, like if you went back in time, right, and told us from 1998, this is what it's going to look like that's crazy. Even though Friday night, I didn't sit down in front of Washington and Rutgers and be like, how in the hell did we get here?
Right.
That's kind of the interesting thing. I really enjoyed the first episode. It was on the TV part of it. Like, I'll be interested to see if the future episodes are as jarring and as exponentially changing as the TV one was, really starting with the antitrust lawsuit. I think my first question for you, I'm curious what you think about this. So, and people can listen to the episode, maybe they know the backstory, but essentially the whole TV landscape changed after Oklahoma and Georgia sued the NCAA on an antitrust basis because they started the CFA thing to manage their own TV rights. The NCAA said, you can't do this. They said, screw you. We're taking you to court. We're going to sue you on antitrust. They end up winning. And so that changed the NCAA's role to be able to regulate some of the rules about being on TV. My question for you is, was there ever a way, like, let's say they didn't form the CFA or Georgia and Oklahoma don't sue. Was there a way that the NCAA could have done that and not been sued into perpetuity in future years? Could they have made that work in some way, or even by doing it slightly different, or if that whole episode hadn't happened?
The legal answer I will give you is, and again, I'm not an actively practicing lawyer. Please don't rely on me for your antitrust lawsuit advice. I think if they had kept it in-house and if they had run it all through the NCAA, they still would have had an antitrust problem at some point. Now, would the networks have called them on it? I don't know.
Yeah. You got to have a plaintiff too,
right, Yeah. Right. Like, I don't know if Fox would have come along and said, we've been shut out of college football for 10 years and we're sick of it. This is a cartel. We're taking you to court. I think if they had, they would have won on the same basis, frankly. But I don't know that it would have, I think there was something very different about the call coming from inside the house. As a practical matter, though, I think if they had kind of taken the biggest brands, your Oklahoma and Georgia, your Notre Dames, your Texases, your USCs, at that time, your Penn States, your Nebraskas, and sort of said, okay, we're going to give you, we're going to acknowledge that you deserve a bigger piece of the pie because you are driving a lot of the value of these contracts, and we're going to give you a more active seat at the table in deciding what the television deal looks like, how many appearances teams get, things like that. Yeah, I think they could have solved it. I think, a lot of how we got here was the intransigence of the NCAA at the time of sort of saying, you're either going to do what we say and we make the plan, or we're going to kick you out of the league. Like, that was the threat that the CFA faced, was we will throw you out of the NCAA, not just for football, but for all your sports if you do this.
Yeah. And I don't want to get too far down the legal wormhole, but like you said in the pod, we could maybe get people CLE hours for this if we do a little bit. But like other than baseball's antitrust exemption, like there's obviously some limited exceptions for pro leagues when it comes to television rights. Otherwise, the NFL, right, wouldn't be able to sell their rights. Is there any? Why hasn't that ever accrued to the NCAA? Is that just because it's organizationally very different than what the NFL and NBA and Major League Soccer are, for instance?
I think the practical answer is, and this is something that is a direct result of what happened in the 1984 Supreme Court case. The NCAA, there's no one entity that holds all the rights, because the Southeastern Conference is selling its games, and because the ACC is selling its games, and so on and so forth. And even within that, there are sometimes, like this is how you got the Longhorn Network, there are sometimes teams that keep a limited set of rights. And I think that creates enough participants in the economy that you can't point to any one of them and sort of say like, oh, okay, you are the sole representative of college football on television from a negotiating perspective. And like, we see this, CBS didn't want to pay the SEC anymore. So now the ESPN is, and CBS is working with the Big Ten. And I think that decentralization of it has saved it from antitrust concerns because, and we mentioned this a little bit in the episode, even the CFA, which was basically every college football team except those in the Big Ten and the Pac-10 at the time, even they started getting sniffed around by the FTC to sort of say, like, we think you may be in violation of antitrust here as well. But now it's so fragmented that, like, the idea, like, look, are you selling the same thing? But no, you can, if you don't want to buy Big Ten football, you can buy MAC football. It's a different entity that you go and negotiate with. So it does look a little bit more like a competitive marketplace, I would say.
Ryan, you mentioned earlier in the pod, every little move in a vacuum is like fine, but obviously when we get here, we're like, how the hell did this happen? I use that to ask you about this in particular, like of all of the changes that have happened to college football. I have to imagine the majority of the fans of the sport are very sympathetic to more games being on television. It makes you a more informed fan. You're more entertained. I know that I love sitting down and quad boxing multiple TVs on a Saturday to have as many games into my eyeballs as possible. And yet we now view the sport as being run by the networks themselves. I wonder how you then kind of view those things, because in the future episodes, I have to imagine that you're going to look at entities and say, this was bad, like full stop or most of the way. Whereas this one is the one where I imagine I will find myself much more sympathetic to the cause than I will other times.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And I think part of where I think we landed in this episode is it would be foolish to expect television networks to act like anything else than they are. Like, it doesn't make sense for ESPN or Fox to be like, we are stewards of the sport. Like, that's not what they're in the business of, and I don't think it would necessarily make sense for them to be in the business of that. I know he's talked about it on other shows, but, Steven grew up a Georgia Southern fan because his dad's a Georgia Southern fan. And he's talked about how, when he was a kid, you couldn't watch Georgia Southern on TV. You couldn't even, there wasn't even like internet radio that you could listen to or something like that. So they had friends in Statesboro that would send them the newspaper, and they'd get it like on Tuesday or Wednesday in the mail, so that they could see like, okay, we know the score, but like what actually happened in this game? We can read the game recap. This is obviously a much better way to live. The idea that not only can you watch these games no matter where you live, but you can watch games that you have nothing to do with. It is like, I think it makes for a much richer experience. I don't cry for the days of like, oh, I wish we could only watch the same 14 teams on television all the time. Now, I think what's interesting is this. This is not something we put in the show, and I don't even know if this is the conclusion we're going to get to. But if we get to Super League status and we're like, all right, we got, let's call it 40 teams. Now we're going to kind of live in that world again. We're going to kind of live in like, oh, this is what the menu is, and it's a lot smaller than it used to be. It's a lot more accessible, and you don't have to worry that, is it your team's turn on television this week? But it will start to feel a lot smaller and a lot weirder. I don't know if that's where we'll end up, but it's entirely possible.
Josh, we've talked about this before a little bit, like some of the weird memories of that era, that post lawsuit era when the games. Josh, I remember watching in the late 80s, watching Nebraska games repeatedly on the local PBS affiliate. Like Ryan, like there were multiple games on just Channel 12 over the air in Nebraska and nowhere else. I don't know if you guys got into that if further and looking at this, but that whole Wild West would be fun to look at what the TV deals and situations were like locally in a lot of those places at that time.
And what's interesting about that, and we got into this a little bit in the episode, is that once the market opened up, the TV deals were not very good to begin with. These schools were making way less money than they were, and that's, I think, why you had things like, okay, we're just going to put it on a local affiliate. Like, somebody brought up that in old versions of the NCAA video game, if you played with like a group of 5 type team and you weren't very good and you didn't have a good opponent, you wouldn't get commentators on your game.
That's
you
true.
Had to get better.
I remember that.
And that was an accurate reflection of like some TV broadcasts at that time, is you would just get the sort of like, we set up a camera for you and we'll let you hear the in-stadium audio, and that's it. They didn't have play-by-play. They didn't do color commentary.
Oh, is there a world, Ryan, where the sport is so fragmented, right? Where the Big Ten is negotiating for itself and the SEC negotiates for itself. Like, was there ever a time where the big dogs or all of the dogs rather could have gotten together and negotiated? Because, you mentioned a few minutes ago about the Pac-12. I feel like we don't have to be in this world if everyone would work together. Now, people are probably listening to this and saying you're an idiot for thinking they would ever. As we record this around the news that the Big Ten and the SEC are about to have this meeting where they discuss a scheduling alliance, and I'm sure that's going to go over very, very well. But I just always think about that. Like, the NFL does it and it works. All these leagues do it. College football does not. And I wonder if they are either A, leaving money on the table, or at the very least leaving the romanticism of college football on the table.
So I'm not going to give too much away here because we are finishing up the next episode we're doing is about conferences, and we get into this in some detail, and so I don't want to like give everything away.
We're supposed to be promoting the podcast, not spoiling the pod, or not a Cliff's Note situation, right? Got it.
But I think it's a good question, and what bugs me the most about it is this: throughout the history of this sport, you get all kinds of people, usually conference commissioners, bemoaning all of this change. Like, this happened when the Pac-12 died. You heard, the Big Ten and the Big 12 both coming out, athletic directors, school presidents, whatever, being like, oh, it's such a shame. It's so sad. I'm like, who do you think was eating this like, what are you talking? And I don't even disbelieve them. I do think there is some element of the people in charge who feel like, oh, this all kind of stinks. But the economic incentives have forced their hand into this direction. So I guess the question is, like, what's interesting is that they have shown an ability to work together in the past. Like, the BCS was a creation of the conferences, specifically the power conferences. They didn't do a good job of including the lesser conferences. And that's why you had BYU and Boise State and TCU like pissed at them forever. Kansas State was pissed at them forever. So I think they show that when they want to, they can make it work. And to your point, I think there is probably more money to when they make it work. But here's the problem. The NFL gets to be a fixed size. And the idea of expanding is so hard. Like, they would always rather move a team than expand a team. We haven't, the Texans are the last team, I think.
22 years ago.
New to the league. So they know, like, if we can make the pot grow, we don't have to split it more ways. And that's always been the challenging thing about conference realignment or schools, conferences working together is it's like, okay, yeah, you can make number go up, but now if you have to split it with 4 more schools, 10 more schools, 20 more schools, like, how much is that worth it? It's also just like, and you have some of this in the NFL as well, but like, I don't want to go back to the Big 12 for everything, but Texas being Texas becomes this big challenge. And like the NFL has plenty of marquee franchises and plenty of franchises that are more popular than others, but they don't really have anybody who can, like if Jerry Jones was like, I'm going to leave, I'm going to go start my own football league. I mean, they'd sue him to hell, for one. But second of all, I don't think they'd be that worried. I don't think they'd be like, oh no, the NFL is going to fall apart without one franchise. Like that's I think the biggest difference is you have all these differing levels of power and influence in college football between conferences and within conferences that make it really hard to figure out, like, can we get everybody on the same page?
Ryan, as you were doing the research and looking back at all of these stories for the different topics for the podcast, I wonder if you saw moments where, you know, whether it was the NCAA or the schools or the conferences were just short-sighted with the benefit of hindsight now, where it was like, man, if you could have only seen where this is going, if you had any idea what would happen to technology or the financial incentives, did you see that happening throughout this? Is that like, would that be one of the reasons that college football was essentially quote unquote killed?
Yeah, I think there's two ways in which that takes form. One is that like you didn't have a good sense of where things were going. The NCAA fighting against television was part of like a general fear that television would squash the sport. It would kill attendance. It would like kill off, you know, smaller teams. And it was
sounds funny now.
Yeah,
it sounds like not doesn't make sense now.
It was based on an amateurish understanding of what the technology would be and how it would work. And their failure to sort of appreciate like what it could mean as an opportunity, I think, sunk them, certainly from a perspective of being like having a meaningful place at the television table. But then you have other things like, you know, you look at some of the long-term deals that some of these conferences did, the ACC deal that we're currently litigating. Like, part of that is, you know, when you make a deal that at the time you're like, this is so good, this is so great. It's like, okay, is it going to feel that way in 10 years? Is it going to feel that way in 20 years? And I think like that's one where it felt like, okay, you're making a decision that's going to make everybody happy today, but you are laying a trap for yourself down the line. The other one that sticks out, I think, and this is not obvious, or this is not like a surprise rather to anyone who's going to listen to this, the NCAA and the conference's failure to sort of figure out, like, what are we going to do about player compensation?
Yeah.
Ed O'Bannon started this lawsuit forever ago and was successively winning stages of it. And that's at, like, a very narrow piece of what name, image, and likeness was supposed to be. And it's still so shocking to me that there wasn't somebody somewhere in the NCAA, in the SEC or the Big Ten or somewhere who's like, okay, we don't want to use this plan. It is behind glass with a little break in case of emergency hammer. But if we get killed at the Supreme Court, and if we get told like your players are employees, or basically, you know, like you are engaging in employee-like activity, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to run the system in a way that's good for us, that won't get us sued more, that can like keep the game going. And there isn't one. The answer was, we'll go to Congress and we'll see if they can help us out. And that's gone really poorly. That's I think, probably the best example of short-sightedness, truly. It's like, we're going to put all our chips in, we'll beat you in court.
For sure.
And then have no backup plan whatsoever.
For sure. Yep.
Ryan, you mentioned earlier you and Godfrey have been, I mean, this has been something that you've been talking about for 5 years or so. There are a lot of suspects that you could have done. The first episode was about television. You've mentioned the next one will be about conferences. Whittling down that number to 6, right, is what it's going to be. Mm-hmm. How difficult was that? Or throughout the course of the research, did that number emerge kind of fairly obviously for you?
The way we sort of approached it is we sort of said, like, okay, who are the groups that can make decisions that tilt us one way or the other, that tilt us back towards, we'll call it sanity, and further towards like mess and chaos? And we sort of went through a slightly longer list, maybe of like 10 potential groups or something, and sort of said like, okay, could these groups actually do this? And that's how we sort of landed on like the 6 that we want to talk about and sort of like, figure out, are there points to go back to your earlier point of like, where were there short-sighted decisions? That's where we sort of said like, who were the people who could have made better decisions at that point? And that's how we landed on 6 groups that I think, again, without giving too much away, I think have all like various levels of culpability and involvement in how we got here. But, and I said this somewhere else, what's interesting about the sport is that there's a lot of groups and people that have the power to change things, often for ways that we might not like. But there's not necessarily a lot of people that have the power to fix things by themselves. Like, fixing requires collaboration. Breaking, you can kind of do just by one at a time.
Hey, Ryan, we're both radio guys by trade, and now we've kind of created this thing that we're doing right now. And, you guys have been, I say you guys, I'm kind of talking about that extended universe, but you guys have kind of been doing eventually affiliated, but now some unaffiliated media and some independent media. And I know that exists for every sport, but I'm kind of curious why that works for college football like it does. It seems to particularly. Now, Josh will probably say, "Oh, Jack, there's like 8 NBA. There's all kinds of great NBA podcasts. There's an NBA version of Shutdown Fullcast, and it's hilarious." Like, that might be, and I wouldn't know if it exists, but I found myself and Josh like particularly taken with a whole bunch of the independent media around college football. Like, I listen to it. I'm a fan of other sports. I'm a fan of the NFL. I'm a fan of Major League Baseball. I don't listen to that for any other sport. I don't know what it is. It's probably because I'm a fan of the whole sport, but I wonder what your perspective is in having gone through that process and sort of talking to the consumers regularly.
The first thing is that it is a very big sport. And it's not just a very big sport. It's a sport that is important in lots of different ways, or at least it has been important in lots of different ways. The Egg Bowl is a great example. You don't need Ole Miss and Mississippi State to be good for the Egg Bowl to be good. But if you have, the Lakers playing the Clippers and it's the, dog end of the season and both teams are missing the playoffs, it's like, it's not going to have juice. It's just probably not. It won't mean the same thing. So college football has managed to maintain little pockets of interest and sort of heat that are irrespective of sort of the national importance or conversation of the thing that's going on. The other thing is that college football is, I think, the most opinion-based sport we have, or at least the most opinion-based team sport. And, it's built into it. The AP poll and the coaches poll are important. They're not as important as they used to be. They used to be how we decided who the national champion was. But we have built into this for decades the idea that what we think, and the we can be people, computers, coaches, whatever, is not just important, but it's one of the most important things. We do media days and let's talk about preseason rankings. Nobody's doing the NFL isn't let's
look at the power rankings.
Right. The NFL isn't let's get your NFC East votes for who you think's gonna. They don't care because the pathways it's really clear what's gonna happen. But we have all lived with this sport where coaches have to go out and they have to politic and they have to say here's why you should think my team is bigger and shinier. We all got to have a big argument about Florida State, because this is a opinion-based sport and a perspective-based sport that I think that kind of reinforces the value of independent media to a lot of people, because the alternative is a lot of well, who do you work for? Who are you naturally sort of biased towards? That's Paul Feinbaum's perfectly good radio. But nobody is confused about where that paycheck is coming from or what sort of point of view he's supposed to represent. And I think fans can like that, but they also have a lot more room to say I would like to hear from somebody who has biases that are personal but are not necessarily professional.
Ryan, last one from me. Is it a sign of a healthy sport or an unhealthy sport that you're doing a podcast like this and we're having a conversation like this today?
It's probably if I had to pick one, I would say it's probably a sign of a healthy sport because people still care and people still can have opinions about this and people still want to know about it. Like, you know, if you are Major League Baseball and you are dealing with like the idea that there are teams that just sit at the bottom of the payroll standings and just sort of benefit from revenue sharing and don't field a competitive team, like that's a real like active problem that you have to figure out. And that's sort of going in a different direction. But I think the idea that people want to know what's happening to my sport and why and what does it means that they care and means that they're still engaged and means that they're engaged at multiple levels and that we haven't gotten to the point where if you don't root for one of the teams that's going to win double digits games, like the sport doesn't matter to you. I don't think we're there yet, and I'm hopeful that we're still a ways off.
Ryan Nanni, host of Who Killed College Football, as well as the Shutdown Fullcast. You can subscribe, obviously, wherever you get your podcasts, and you can go to wkcfb.substack.com if you would like to become a paid subscriber. What is behind the paywall over there, Ryan, for those who want to get involved with the Substack?
We're doing some Q&A episodes where we will field questions from the paid subscribers. We'll put out like a little conversation between Godfrey and I, sort of either getting into topics that we didn't get into on an episode, letting people sort of poke holes in what our arguments, that kind of thing. We'll probably have some exclusive interviews, maybe stuff that we didn't use the entirety of in an episode or something we just decided to save entirely. And there's early access to the episodes starting with episode 2.
Awesome.
Nice.
Very much enjoyed the first episode. Both Jack and I did. Highly recommend it. So go check it out wherever you get your podcast, Who Killed College Football. Ryan, man, this was such a fun conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time for us today.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Coming up later this week in the I-80 Club, Max Olson will join us for another +1, and Jack Mitchell and I will have our usual Wednesday night Into Club episode coming up Wednesday, 8 o'clock. You can become a subscriber to our work as well, patreon.com/I-80 Club. We will talk to you later.